This is Your Own Best Company, a podcast for people who love to work alone. Hey everybody, Franklin Taggart here with Your Own Best Company, a podcast for people who love working alone. And I am welcoming back Audrey Holst, one of my absolute favorite people on earth. Yay. Hey Audrey.
Hey, so fun to be back. This is the best.
Well, we're going to be picking each other up today. We're going to be lifting each other up and getting each other back up on a higher rock. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it occurs to me when you're talking about people who like to work alone. I'm like, it doesn't mean we want to be alone.
No.
We like being together. It's just the working situation that is particular flavor we like.
It just means that I can't focus worth a damn if there's anybody else around.
Right. It's a style preference.
Yeah, and I also get pretty energized by the whole thing.
Totally.
So, we've been chatting in the wings here about some really important stuff. And one of the things that came up was just kind of working through, as a solopreneur, working through those times when we're at our most human.
Yeah.
And the frame that we kind of gave that was that sometimes we have to go through things like grief, and sometimes we have to go through things like change, and sometimes we have to go through things like stupid government decisions, and sometimes we have to go through things like, all this stuff. And we have to navigate through all of that and continue to operate a business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So where do we go with that, Audrey?
Yeah. I think maybe I'll share my experience this week as a reference point, because I think sometimes when you can hear what somebody else has gone through, maybe it just gives people a jumping off point to understand maybe what that looks like in their own lives. Because I know that in my circles, people are going through all sorts of stuff with caretaking and parents and children and marriages, and there's a lot of stuff going on. For myself personally, this time of year, that I had a lot of things kind of come together at the same time. This time of year is approaches the anniversary of my mother's passing. Yeah. So that got thrown into the water. We just had the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And I also spent a lot of time with friends that have very traditional work and family lives, which is different than how I live my life. And sometimes it can be very easy for me to get caught up in comparison. Yeah. Of like, what am I doing? So when I have that, so I basically was having this underlying grief of missing my mom and like wanting to call her up and just have her tell me everything's going to be okay. Right. And not having access to that, and that being really, really hard for me. And then mixing in the waters of all of these other pieces. I could feel that I wasn't in the shallow end of sadness. Like I sort of started describing this as sadness for me is like a kiddie pool. Like you're just kind of wading in the kiddie pool and you can feel the sadness, but it feels like you can get your head above water. Grief for me is more like you're in the deep end. You can't feel your feet on the bottom and you're exhausted and it's hard to keep your head above water. It's this very all-consuming, intense, visceral feeling. And
it's the most accurate metaphor I've ever heard.
Oh my God. So perfect. I'm a visceral person. I'm a kinesthetic person, and that's how I feel. That's how I move through the world, right? That's how I feel. And so it was taking me out in a way that like I have a very visceral memory of me like on the kitchen floor, literally on the floor, just sobbing. Like it would take me over these waves and where I was just could not get my head above water. And I've got a lot of things in the works right now. I've got contracts that are being signed. I've got negotiations for summits, right? There's business that continues to go. Yeah. And I had a conversation with one of my coaches, and I just expressed to her what was going on. And she looked at me and she said, we can talk about business, but you can't right now, if you are trying to make decisions you're not going to be able to make a good decision. Everything that you do is going to take you 5 times longer than it will take you at any other time. Like the grief is a thing that is your job right now, right? Like that's what you need to address. And I knew she was right. And I was feeling that pressure of like, but I got to make this work, right? Like I've got financial obligations. I've got these things. And ultimately I was like, okay, we did actually end up talking about strategy. We did talk about some strategy stuff. So I took some notes. So I'm like, okay, I just want to keep this clear in my head that these are my next steps, right? This is where I know where I'm going next. But ultimately it was so true. Like I could notice that day I couldn't make decisions very clearly. I even went to go meet a friend for dinner, and it took me like, I changed outfits 3 times. I was like, I don't like these shorts. I don't know what to wear. I couldn't figure out if I want to bike or if everything was just murky. I couldn't make good decisions. And I noticed that I couldn't make good decisions.
Yeah.
And the next day, and so there was this whole process of riding this wave. And the next day I woke up and it was like it's like the wave had passed, like the storm had passed. I was standing on solid ground looking around, and the sun was out. And I was like, oh, right.
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking about decisions. I was just making them. I wasn't getting stuck in this churn. I was just moving forward. It was a very different, it was just like, okay, if I knew the advice was good in the moment, but like literally having that experience on the other side of it was very different. So that's kind of the starting point of this conversation is I am the business, right? I am the owner. I'm the founder. I am the employees. I am the marketing department. I am the, and I have contractors for all sorts of different things, but ultimately the buck starts and ends with me. So when the balls drop, the balls drop.
So, and in the midst of all of that, you've been kind of going through a transition in your business as well, from being primarily a person who coached individuals to being a person who works with corporations and organizations. Whole different ball of wax. So you've got a bunch of balls in the air with that as well.
Yes.
And in the midst of that, all of this humanity has to happen.
Yeah. And I think that the blessing is letting the humanity happen, because and the learning is letting the humanity happen, because the more I try to fight or push through, the worse things tend to go.
Yeah. Do you mind me asking, how long has it been since your mother passed?
It's been about 16 years.
Okay. So it's been a while. It's interesting to me is that the grief changes for events like that over the years, but it doesn't go away.
Right.
There's still a hole there, and we still have to live with the hole. And it's like, I don't know that ever goes away.
No, I don't think it does. And even I notice talking about, right, today I'm talking about what it's like to miss my mother, and I'm able to talk about it in a very straightforward way. Even like 2 days ago, I couldn't talk about that without having tears down my face. And prior to that, right, that would take me out. Talking about that was taking me out completely. So even in a period of a week, how I'm relating to that has shifted, right? How I'm able to talk about that has shifted. And that's, I think it's one of the things that I see a lot, right? I do a lot of work with perfectionism. A lot of the people I work with, high achieving people who have these perfectionist tendencies. And when we get stuck on the way that we should be processing something, or the way grief should go, or the way we should mourn, or should be able to push through, or when we aren't meeting ourselves exactly in the moment where we are, and we are getting stuck in the comparison of how we perceive other people to be handling things, or the way we think it's supposed to look, and what's the timeline on this, and am I doing that right? That's a journey.
Oh, it is. And it's like, the other thing that's really interesting is like people on the outside will ask you what's wrong or what's the matter. And it's really hard to answer. And one of the reasons that I think that is because grief isn't about one thing. It's like when grief happens, it's about everything. It's like, everything that's ever happened that you've lost, or that that has gone through some kind of significant change. It's like the grief is about everything. It's not about one thing. So it's hard to talk about.
That's exactly right, because that's what happens in our bodies, right, is there's associations, that there's a certain sensation and then the associations come flooding in. So it can be this one particular thing that starts it, but then once that sensation comes in, that sensation of grief, the associations come flooding in also, and that can just snowball things. I'm curious how you relate to this in terms of being like humanness and doing business and moving forward and taking pot, or however you want to describe what that looks like for you.
Well, I've been through a lot of pretty deep traumatic experiences in my life. I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this, but I started out, I wanted to be a professional musician. And finally, about, 10 years after I graduated from college, I actually had the ability to do that for a few years. Ultimately, that was interrupted by illness. But in the midst of all of that, my wife and I had our first child who died. And so what I like to tell people is that my 40s were just one big thing after another. It started out with our daughter dying, being born and dying. It started with going from being single to being married. And then our son was born 2 years after that. He was healthy and is still with us and is just a god-awful, amazing boy. But then when he was about 2 years old, I started to have tendonitis in both of my arms. And I couldn't play the guitar. I couldn't. It would be like I could play for maybe just a few minutes, but then I would have sharp shooting pains that would go all the way from my fingers up to my shoulders in both arms.
Yeah.
And so there was no way that I could perform, and it was really hard to teach. And it was all of those ways that I was making my money all of a sudden went goodbye.
Yeah.
And then about 2 years later, I started to have really horrible sickness. And it manifested as organ failure. Like my liver, my lungs, my heart, all of them were starting to shut down. And so all of this happened during the decade of my 40s. And in the midst of all of that,
there's more.
In the midst of all of that, I still had to find a way to make money.
That right there.
And, that was one of the things. It was like there was a whole lot of spiritual grace that happened in my life at that time. And one of the big spiritual graces that happened during that time was the realization that my musical talent isn't my gift. That realization saved my life. Because at that point, I realized that my gift isn't dependent on a fully functional, healthy body. My gift comes through me, and it's actually not up to me.
Totally. Yeah.
So the breakthrough for me was I was in the hospital. I had major surgery. It's been 10 years ago now. Had major surgery to repair my right lung, and I was in ICU. And a good friend of mine was the hospital chaplain, and he came by that night, and just to see, how I was doing. That was his job. And, he did his job beautifully, and we chatted for a few minutes about me, but then we ended up having a 2.5-hour conversation about his music career and his desire to start taking his music career more seriously and to transition more into it.
Wow.
And at the end of that 2.5 hours, he had to go do more of his work. But I was so wired from that conversation. Now, what had happened in the previous months is that some people had started to come and ask me for help with their career choices and stuff like that. And I didn't even know what I was doing was coaching so much. I had done some business consulting before that, but I didn't recognize what I was doing yet as coaching. But that night in the hospital, all of a sudden I said, there's something I really need to pay attention to here, because I haven't felt this energized. I haven't felt this energized by music ever. And that was an eye-opening experience. And that was when I really had the realization that gifts and talents are not the same thing.
Mm.
So what ended up happening was that over the next couple of years, I was in physical recovery, and they figured out that my thyroid was the culprit, and they treated that, and my symptoms started to go away.
Mm.
I haven't been in perfect health ever since, but I've been in good spirits, and that's worth everything to me at this point. What I know now, though, is that grieving is something that's just a part of life.
Yes.
And it's the process of adapting to new circumstances. Mm-hmm. We all go through it. And one of the things that I realized is that it's primarily an energetic thing.
Yes.
It's something where we're going through a deep energetic adjustment to our new circumstances.
Yes.
And when our energy is consumed by that, it is going to be hard to focus. It is going to be hard to make decisions. It is going to be hard to follow through on commitments. So one of the things that I think that we really need to do is to give each other some space for that humanity. Mm-hmm. And understanding, and instead of making judgments and spreading rumors, actually make a connection with the person and say, is there a way I can support you? You seem to be going through something right now.
Yes.
I think we need to just change that.
It reminds me a little bit of this. There's this theme or this piece that a friend of mine offered to me recently. And my other friend, Abigail Rose Clark, she calls it cosplaying at normal life.
Yeah.
Which I just think is so brilliant. Also, everybody please go follow Abigail Rose Clark. She's genius. But this concept of, right, it's this thing that we have labeled as the right way, which is not showing emotion, which is just showing up no matter what, which is pushing through, which is having a smiling face on even when something awful is happening. And it's not genuine. It's damaging to us personally. I think it's damaging to us collectively. It's damaging to relationships. It's not how we're built as humans.
Yeah.
And it just perpetuates this false narrative that this is normal, right? That just going about like nothing's happening is normal. That if you're emoting, if you're grieving, if you are, right, even we use terms like so-called falling apart. I'm putting that in quotes, falling apart. What, first of all, I mean, again, that's just the words that we use to describe that has a negative, right? It's a negative connotation to it.
Yeah.
And it is so frustrating. The common orientation we have, right? There's this common orientation towards this thing. And you and I are looking at something completely different, right? We're looking at, and we're going through our own personal experiences and how we feel best, how we feel best as human beings moving through a world which is deserved to have reactions to, responses to, feelings about. Even this kind of language around like being human is almost it's business versus human. It's almost this like human is the bad one, but we're going to get on board with that, right? Like people say like, oh God, I hate the whole humaning thing, right? It's like, that's the bad part, but the business is the good part. Well, so even the language we use to talk about our experiences and how we feel about them and the connotations associated with it is so, fraught and says a lot about, I think, everything. I really just ran out of words there. I don't have words. It just says a lot.
Well, I think you're onto something there. And I think that that's one of the things that we're adjusting is our perception. Mm-hmm. And that's just it. It's like my experiences that I went through a decade ago have given me a lot more patience and grace with myself and with others. Mm-hmm. In that, you know what, you go through what you got to go through, And I have a really good friend who's dealing with, the aftermath of a traumatic head injury.
Oh gosh.
And she's been, she had it years ago, but the thing that she talks about is she has this concept called spoons.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
I love that concept. And the way that she describes it is that, at the beginning of every task that you face, you say, how many spoons do I have?
Yep.
And that just gives a way of kind of having an understanding of what energy do I have available for this at this time. Now, the other question that I add to that process is this something that can replenish my energy, or is this something that's going to drain my energy?
Right.
Because the thing that's really fun for me is that if I get into a creative streak, my energy is going to be replenished.
Yes.
Like if I start working on a project, I won't stop until I hit the wall or it's done, whichever happens to come first. And it's one of those things where it's like that kind of activity is a nice replenishing activity. Mm-hmm. It's in solitude, it's reflective, it's imaginative. It doesn't require me to reckon with things so much as it just requires me to be present.
Yes.
And I love that.
Yes.
There's the reset that happens.
Yeah. Something that I think that I'm hearing in what you're saying and I'm relating to is just the concept of borders and limitations as acknowledging borders and limitations. I feel like there is a really, again, language, there's a negative connotation to the word limit. Like, well, limitless is better and limited is bad.
Limitless sells more books.
Right. right. And if we think about things as like you're saying, limited spoons, there's a limited amount of capacity, there's a limited amount of energy, there's a limited amount of time, there's a limited amount of whatever, insert limitation here. And what you're talking about, there's also the refilling. There's the charging the battery, there's the refilling the glass, whatever, again, whatever metaphors you want to use here. But I think that still gives the sense of some sort of a container.
Yeah.
That there's a container that is either taken away from or added to. And I think that that's actually a really helpful lens to use when we think about ourselves, when we think about our business, when we think about what we're putting our time and energy into during the day, because to acknowledge that there are limitations really requires a conscious choosing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to fool ourselves into thinking that limitlessness is the ultimate goal and is the good thing actually takes away from our opportunity to prioritize and really put at the forefront the things that actually matter. Yeah. Not everything is urgent, not everything is important, and not everything needs our attention, but there is this narrative that shouldn't be the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's railing against as things are. That's a fool's game.
Yes.
And quite honestly, I have to say that I think that that's where my illness came from. From living that way for so many years. I just burned it at both ends. Self-care was not a practice of mine.
Yep.
I ate poorly. I smoked. I drank. I didn't get enough sleep. I would be up until 3:00 in the morning on my computer looking at stupid stuff on the internet, and then I'd get up at 7:30 or 8 and start all over again the next day. Yep. And it just was like that went on for years. And my body said, enough.
Yes.
No, you cannot have any more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a completely relatable story. I can tell you from people I've worked with, that is a story that I hear a lot. People who went 24/7 and then hard, and then their bodies went, we're done here, shut things down. And now they are relearning what exists in between, right? That's exactly what you're talking about, is you can't push the 24/7 and you're no longer in the body has shut you down completely. And now there's this now you have to make choices and you have to make decisions and you have to discern. And it's way more nuanced to be making those choices in that middle ground.
I've done a lot of thinking about willpower because I really feel like that has become overrated as well.
Oh yeah, preach, Franklin, go for it.
The thing that I think is really important is, like, we've been kind of told that it's important to play through the pain. It's important to push through to the other side. It's important to just get things done no matter, what the cost is, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think that mindset is killing us. And that I'm not the first person to say that. And one of the books that I've read that I recommend everyone is the book, The Way We're Working Isn't Working by Tony Schwartz. It's such a good
great
book.
Title.
Yeah. And then the other one that I really love is Deep Work by Cal Newport.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that I love about both of those books is that it talks a lot about that it's not really time that we're managing, it's energy. And energy is the core of our focus. It's like, if we don't have energy, the focus can't happen, nor can commitment, nor can, decision making, nor can, even being able to process things thoughtfully is difficult when our energy is low. And so one of the things that I've started to look at is that I believe that our human will is our energy manager. It's the thing that keeps an eye on how much energy do you have, where can it go, and the way that I kind of imagine it is that it's kind of like a spigot for a backyard hose. Your will is the thing that's turning the knob and directing the hose where it can go, right? And if you don't have, if the water's only a trickle, you can turn the hose on all the way, but you're still not going to be able to get it to go anywhere. Right?
Yeah.
So I really feel strongly that our will is something that we need to learn how to partner with and see it as actually, I look at it as a friendly force in my life, that it's really trying to help me, to direct the attention and energy that I have in the places that they need to go. And so one of the things that I've also looked at is the relationship between will and vision. And what's really interesting is that if the will doesn't have a vision behind it, that energy tends to go wherever it wants to go, and it can be wasted.
Right.
But if there's a vision and values that are driving the will, that are behind the will, then it is able to function in the way that really leads that energy to go to places that end up with results that we want. So I'm doing a lot more thinking about that. It's like I said, it's kind of in an early stage of form, but I've been fascinated by that idea that the will is actually an energy manager and not actually the source of our energy. It's like the source of our energy is something else altogether. The will is just managing it.
I love that. And I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about will that way. And I'm curious. So the word that keeps popping up for me when you're talking about will is desire. Is that similar, adjacent, different?
I think that desire is connected, definitely, because desire is an energetic thing.
Sure.
Anything that's energy related is will related, right? Okay. So if we're talking about power, will is attached to that. If we're talking about desire, will is attached to that. If we're talking about commitment, well, all commitment is that we've said we're going to direct our energy in a certain way, right?
Oh, there's something that just passed through me when you said that, because I think the word commitment to me often elicits a bit of a panic response. There's something about the word commitment that creates a bit of and something about I'm not sure exactly how you just said it now, because I had such a visceral reaction when you said it, but it was like, but the direction of your will or direction of your energy.
Yeah. That's all commitment is just directing your will or directing your energy in a certain pathway, you know? It's like, this is where my energy is going to go for the next little while. That's will.
I had this so I would originally so I think and I process in feeling and metaphor and vision. So when you're talking, my brain is coming up with sort of pictures and stuff. And I was really with you with the hose analogy, where I'm like that kind of hose. Now, when we're talking about this, it feels a bit more magical, and it feels almost like you have a magic wand that has a certain amount of power or a certain amount of magic that you can direct in certain directions. And it's kind of like, right, you've got like this meter on your wand where it's like, okay, we can send some energy over there. We can send some energy over there. And now I got to check my wand, how much energy we got. And like, is there anything that I can charge my wand up with? For some reason, that is coming to mind.
That's not a bad way to describe it at all.
It makes it, when I think about my day as a like, where do I want to send my magical energy towards? That sounds so much more pleasurable than what do I want to drag my ass to today?
That's exactly right, though. But and now you're looking at that as a perfect distinction of when the will is in a state of resistance and when it's in the state of allowing. If the will is in a state of resistance, you're going to be dragging your butt wherever you go. If your will is in an open and receptive state of allowing, you won't be able to stop your energy from going where it needs to go.
So, okay, this makes me curious then, Franklin. What is your take on, because I'm going to have all sorts of thoughts, but I really want to know now that we're talking on this, dealing with resistance.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of resistance that comes up in business ownership, especially.
Hell, even when I said the word commitment, you had resistance.
Listen, go on. Preach to me here, Franklin. Teach me some things.
Well, I think that's one of the things that I would look at is that allowing and resistance are the will turning on the hose and turning it off, And I think that one of the things that we've got to look at with resistance is, where's it coming from? Is it that we're imagining a future that we don't want? And if so, is that something that we really need to pay attention to? Because usually with resistance, if it's just happening and we're not consciously driving it, it's usually coming from some kind of a past trauma not wanting to relive its future, right? And so that's one of the things that I would look at, is that resistance coming from a true place. Now, the other thing to ask is the resistance my ego trying to protect me? Because very often ego resistance is about self-protection and self-preservation. And when people talk about comfort zones, they're talking about the edge between resistance and allowing, right? Mm-hmm. So the way that I look at resistance is that there are sometimes when I think that it's a very positive thing, like the resistance to stop my car, to put on the brakes before I, back into the street where that rushing 4-wheel drive truck with the American flag in the back is speeding.
Right.
Yeah, I'm gonna, that resistance is a positive thing.
Positive thing, yeah. Sure.
So the other thing that I think, though, is that when resistance comes up, here's the thing where I think you and I could probably go on for another hour about it. Resistance is a physical thing. It's a body thing, right? Now, the body and the mind are one animal. They're working together, and the body processes whatever the mind sends its way. So if the body is feeling resistance, we've got to look at what's the thinking, or what's the, we've got to make whatever is unconscious conscious in that moment. And one of the ways to do that is through all of the things that you talk about, of just physically processing whatever energetically is happening.
Right.
I think that's one way to process resistance. And very often what I'll do is that if I feel like I'm in a high state of resistance, I'll just sit down in my recliner and I'm going to get my mind into the most expanded space that it can go. And in doing that, my body is allowed to reset. And after that, then I have more clarity about what I really want in that moment.
Yes.
I can make a clear decision because it's not coming from a place of unconscious resistance.
Right.
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 So that's one way of dealing with it that I use fairly frequently.
I think the first thing I would say about resistance is we got to stop villainizing it. Yeah. There's this whole like, and I think this is ripe in the coaching world. How do we overcome resistance? That narrative is pretty common. How do we break through resistance, overcome resistance?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the same thing you were talking about with limits before as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And the first question is, do I really need to overcome this resistance? Do I need to overcome this resistance? That's my first question, right? And I see everything as making sense. I ultimately, right, when I'm in it myself, I have all sorts of opinions and thoughts about whether I like it, but ultimately our bodies, our minds are programmed to anticipate things in order to make things more efficient.
Yeah.
Right. That's a lot of the conversation around the brain is being efficiency and anticipatory. And this is why a lot of, chronic stuff is really shitty, because there's this anticipating of this thing.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to resistance, it's like, well, maybe we don't battle the resistance. Maybe we don't fight the resistance. Maybe we just hang out with the resistance a little while.
That's what I end up doing most of the time. The only reason that I usually want to work through the resistance is because it's uncomfortable.
Sure.
I just don't like the discomfort of it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And like you have a practice that works really well for you, that moving into that expansiveness or moving into that expansion. And I think I feel like it's important to have the both and of practice, the being with and not battling and not fighting and not trying to pull away from, and also the moving through. I think those are both important. I think people often rush to, how do I get out of this as quickly as possible because I hate this? And I get that. And I understand that. And yes, it's important to be able to move forward or to move through something. And I think it's also important to be able to like just be with something for a hot second, and sometimes a little bit longer than a hot second.
Yeah. The only other time that I actually get any kind of concern about resistance is when it's kind of an automatic triggered response when a positive opportunity is put before me. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then I really want to know what's driving this, because it's like I've had a good example recently is that a friend of mine recommended me and referred me for a bundle. And I generally shy away from things like that. And the big reason is because of what happened. It was successful. God have mercy. And what's really tricky is like, I'm part of the reason that I love working alone is because of my sensitivity. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I love about the way that I've set up my business is that I call it trickle down business, because it's like, I love the pace at which my business happens. It's manageable for me. Yep. And sensory overload is something that I pay attention to. And what's really funny is like I participated in this bundle, and all of a sudden I've had over 160 people enroll in my school, and I have no idea how I'm going to connect with these people. I have no idea, because for me, connection is the most important establishment of my business. That's like, that's the highest value that I've got. Yes. So now I'm thinking, oh my God, how am I going to do this? Yes. And so what's really funny is like when I first got invited to be a part of the bundle, I had this overwhelming sense of resistance. And I went ahead and worked through it, got through the resistance, and I said, I've not done one of these before, and I want to find out what's possible here. Mm-hmm. So I went ahead and just signed up for it and went through it. And it's been an extraordinarily positive experience. I've met some wonderful people. I've gotten I've gotten involved in new circles that are compelling and lovely and wonderful. And yet now I've got 160 people plus who've signed up for my school, and I don't have a mechanism in place to welcome them or to connect with them. And it's driving me bonkers.
I think one of the things that's really important for us as human beings, for us as business owners, and I'm sure we've had this conversation a million times, but I'm just going to keep railing on this point because it's been so necessary for me, is to have people in your circles, professional circles, personal circles, that are 100% on board with you, with your mission, with your business, with you as a human being, and can integrate all of those things together and can help you be supported and on track and be celebrated, not just like feel okay, but to be like celebrated in these moments that are really hard. Like I communicated to my coach that, you know, this is where I'm at. And just like FYI, the beginning of my week was really rough. And she basically said, I'm inspired by how well you take care of yourself. Like that is actually a really admirable thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so to hear that is an encouraging thing. That's not, people don't really say that to each other, right? Like, I'm inspired by how well you take care of yourself. That's not weird, like bad, but just an unusual thing to hear or to receive.
Yeah. It's like, I just noticed something.
So I think it's really important to have these people and spaces, or maybe it's listening to podcasts like this, right? Maybe you're listening to Franklin on a regular basis and you're like, wow, I really resonate with this person and their perspective in the world. And that makes me feel more cared for and more like how I am and what I do is for lack of better language, like the right way. And it's okay. And it's not only okay, it's actually the best way, right? Like this is the best thing. This is better than normal. This is like living a full human existence, like a full human existence.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I think, one way or another, I think life has a way of bringing us back around to that. And if we're paying attention and we, kind of learn to go along with what life brings instead of trying to control what life is and does, I think there's some amazing things that can happen. Well, one of the things that came to my mind as you were talking about that was that back in my days of corporate consulting, which is now a couple of decades ago, I worked with a partner, and I think this definition came from a church that he was a part of, but it was the definition of community, and it stuck with me for years. And the definition that they had of community was knowing and being known, loving and being loved. There was one that was about contribution, and I can't remember what it was, but the last one was celebrating and being celebrated.
Yes.
And I loved that definition. And it was one of those things where it was like, that is us together as humans. That's what we can be.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
So having those pockets of real community is essential. Yeah.
And it comes up over and over again in entrepreneurial spaces, how much people need cheerleading and how necessary. It's not a nice to have, it's actually a necessity, I think, in business. And especially when you're a business of one, celebration is so important.
Well, Audrey, that feels like a really good note to end on.
Oh, we took a journey.
What a fun one though, huh?
Oh, this was so great. I feel like I drank from the well and I am full.
Yeah, me too. Me too. It's been a beautiful thing. So everybody, Audrey Holst can be found at fortitudeandflow.com. Lately, she's been working, mostly with corporations, organizations, some of them in the legal space, helping them to find ways to process their tendency toward perfectionism, among other things. But Audrey is a Renaissance woman that everybody needs to know. So definitely check out what she's got going on at fortitudeandflow.com. Audrey, thank you so much, and I can't wait till our next time.
Thank you so much. This was awesome as usual, Franklin.
Thanks for listening to Your Own Best Company. If you enjoyed the show, would you do me a favor and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast host? If you really love it, leave me a review or share it with your circles. If you feel like your career is reaching a dead end, or you're feeling a deep sense of dissatisfaction in your work right now, I help people discover their gifts and then find or create new opportunities that are the best fit for their talent, experience, and lifestyle. Email me at coaching@franklintaggart.com for more information. I also help people start, finish, and launch creative projects, and I offer an ongoing marketing mastermind for solopreneurs and freelancers. More information on these programs and services can be found at franklintaggart.com. Thanks again for spending this time with me.